The judge fined him without even hearing his explanation, seeing only a black man and passing judgment without a second thought, unaware that he was facing a major sponsor of a justice reform charity. That fine was the last straw. What Jordan did next would shock even the most seasoned. But let's start from the beginning. The courtroom was buzzing with chatter, packed from wall to wall with people awaiting their cases. In the front row sat Jordan Davis, a well-dressed black man in his mid-30s, wearing a tailored navy suit with a crisp white shirt and a deep red tie. His posture was poised, his gaze steady, exuding a quiet confidence as he prepared to address the court. Jordan's calm expression masked his determination. He was here not just for himself, but on behalf of a charity fund committed to judicial reform. This role, however, was something he kept confidential to avoid any bias or media attention on his own life. As Jordan waited, Judge Harold Williams entered the courtroom, his black robe flowing with an air of authority. In his 60s, Judge Williams was a white man with graying hair and a severe, almost calculating expression. Known for his rigid views and a history of dismissive attitudes toward marginalized groups, he was a fixture in the judicial system, one who rarely showed empathy for those he perceived as troublemakers or outsiders. When Judge Williams' gaze fell on Jordan, he immediately narrowed his eyes, taking in the man before him with a look of scrutiny. Jordan, noticing this, shifted slightly, preparing to explain his presence. But before he could say a word, the judge, clearly assuming Jordan was there as a defendant, spoke up with a cold authority. "State your name and your business here today," Judge Williams demanded, his voice filled with an edge of impatience. Jordan rose, maintaining his composure. "Your Honor, my name is Jordan Davis. I'm here on behalf of the Community Justice Fund, representing a charity dedicated to judicial reform," he explained, his tone respectful yet firm. Judge Williams's face hardened, his lips pressing into a thin line as he listened, though it was clear he wasn't fully absorbing Jordan's words. Instead, he cut him off abruptly, his voice dismissive. "Mr. Davis, I suggest you drop the act. This courtroom isn't the place for theatrics. I don't appreciate false pretenses." His tone dripped with condescension, and a slight smirk pulled at the corner of his mouth. Stunned but resolute, Jordan tried once again to clarify. "Your Honor, with respect, I'm here in an official capacity. I represent—" Judge Williams raised a hand to silence him. "Enough. I've heard enough." He shuffled through some papers in front of him before returning his gaze to Jordan. "For disrupting court proceedings and attempting to deceive this court, I am imposing a fine," he announced, almost relishing the words. A murmur rippled through the room, and Jordan's jaw clenched ever so slightly. He stood there, absorbing the humiliation, every fiber of his being resisting the urge to react. Judge Williams, with an air of finality, motioned for Jordan to be seated, already moving on to the next case, as though Jordan were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. As the session ended, Jordan left the courtroom, his head held high, but inside, he felt the sting of injustice. The judge had reduced him to a stereotype, dismissing him without a second thought simply because of his assumptions. But rather than feel defeated, Jordan's resolve only strengthened. The injustice he'd just experienced was exactly what his charity fought to address, and now the fight had become personal. Outside the courthouse, Jordan took a deep breath, grounding himself in the mission he'd committed to long ago. He knew that changing a broken system was a battle that required resilience, patience, and above all, a relentless drive for justice. And today's experience only fueled his determination. The encounter with Judge Williams had lit a fire within him, one that would drive him to confront the system, not just for himself, but for every person who had ever been unjustly dismissed. This was just the beginning. Back in his sleek office, lined with tall bookshelves, Jordan Davis sat at his desk, his mind replaying the courtroom scene from earlier that day. His fingers tapped rhythmically on his laptop keyboard as he sifted through case files and court records, noting patterns and statistics that highlighted the very issues he sought to fight. His recent encounter with Judge Williams had left a bitter taste, yet he channeled that frustration into focused determination. Jordan's office was modern and understated, with large windows that overlooked the bustling city below. The space reflected his disciplined, yet creative approach to his work. Minimal clutter, organized folders, and a large whiteboard covered in notes and diagrams. In one corner, a stack of reports from the Community Justice Fund awaited his attention, each document detailing specific instances of judicial overreach, biased rulings, and excessive fines levied on those least able to pay. Jordan's startup success had allowed him to fund the charity himself, and he spared no expense when it came to its mission. His team members, lawyers, community organizers, and data analysts from various backgrounds were passionate, each motivated by personal experiences or deep convictions about justice. They had been tirelessly gathering evidence and building cases to highlight the disproportionate impact of court fines on low-income citizens and minorities. These were not just numbers. Behind each fine, there was a story, a family affected, a life burdened by debt. As Jordan pored over the files, he found himself increasingly frustrated by the data. Many cases echoed his own experience, individuals fined or penalized by a system that seemed to target them based on their background rather than their actions. He noted how fines for minor infractions were often several times higher for low-income individuals than they were for those from wealthier backgrounds. The evidence was overwhelming, and each statistic deepened his resolve to make a difference. He looked up as one of his lead lawyers, Lisa Chang, entered the office. Lisa, a sharp-minded attorney in her 40s with a reputation for fighting against systemic bias, held a stack of reports under her arm and wore an expression of empathy mixed with frustration. "Jordan, we're seeing the same issues in dozens of cases across multiple counties," she began, laying the reports on his desk. "These fines are ruining people's lives, and what happened to you in court today? It's just one example of how deep-rooted these biases are." Jordan nodded, his expression hardening. "I know, Lisa. It's personal now," he replied quietly, his voice calm but edged with determination. "What happened today isn't just about me. It's about everyone in those files. The judge assumed he knew everything about me with just one look. Imagine how many people face that same judgment every day without the resources to fight back." The experience with Judge Williams had shifted something in Jordan. He saw more clearly than ever that the mission of the Community Justice Fund needed to go beyond just providing legal aid. It had to educate communities and hold the system accountable. They couldn't change things case by case. It was time to push for real, lasting policy reform. "Let's focus our next campaign on rights education," he said, glancing at Lisa. "We need to make sure people know their rights before they even set foot in a courtroom. And we need to raise awareness about these fines and the impact they have on everyday lives. If we can rally public support, we'll have the momentum to push for policy changes." Lisa's face lit up with a hint of a smile, and she nodded, already brainstorming ways to mobilize their efforts. She knew that with Jordan's leadership and their team's dedication, they could create waves of change. Over the following weeks, Jordan and his team launched a series of initiatives to reach communities often overlooked by the legal system. They held workshops in neighborhood centers, created easy-to-understand guides on courtroom rights, and developed a public-facing campaign to expose the disproportionate impact of court fines. The team also built a network of pro bono lawyers who volunteered to represent those unfairly targeted, ensuring that no one would have to stand alone against the system. Jordan's experience had sparked a renewed commitment within him. He wasn't just driven by the desire to prove himself or his charity's mission. Now, it was about creating a world where individuals would no longer be judged or penalized based on superficial assumptions. Each workshop, each case review, and each community meeting brought him closer to his goal, to see justice served for everyone, regardless of their background. It was a crisp autumn morning as Jordan Davis returned to the same courtroom, but this time he was not alone. Flanked by representatives from the Community Justice Fund and a few well-known members of the media, he walked through the courthouse entrance with a sense of purpose. Dressed in a tailored dark suit and a light blue tie, Jordan's expression was resolute. Cameras flashed as reporters jostled for position, eager to capture this unexpected turn of events. Word had spread quickly about the charity's upcoming report on judicial bias, and everyone wanted to see what the charity's findings would reveal. As Jordan and his team entered the courtroom, Judge Williams glanced up from the bench, his eyes narrowing when he saw the gathering crowd and media presence. He hadn't expected this level of attention. Used to conducting his court in relative obscurity, he was visibly taken aback by the sudden influx of reporters, lawyers, and spectators. His usual smirk appeared, a half-hearted attempt to maintain his typical air of authority, but there was a hint of discomfort in his expression. Jordan took his seat in the front row, surrounded by his team and representatives from the Community Justice Fund. Beside him, Lisa Chang, the lead attorney, was flipping through her notes, ready to present their meticulously gathered evidence. The tension in the room was palpable as Judge Williams adjusted his robe, clearly rattled but attempting to mask it. He glanced at Jordan, recognition flashing in his eyes as he remembered the man he had so dismissively fined weeks earlier. But today, Jordan was here not as a solitary figure, but as the powerful benefactor of a movement. When the session began, Lisa stood up, holding a thick folder filled with the charity's report on judicial bias and the impact of court-imposed fines on low-income communities. Clearing her throat, she addressed the court with unwavering conviction. Your Honor, on behalf of the Community Justice Fund, we present a report detailing systematic judicial bias and the undue burden of fines levied upon underprivileged communities, she announced, her voice echoing through the room. Judge Williams' smirk began to falter as Lisa continued, presenting each finding with clarity and precision. She outlined how fines were disproportionately imposed on minorities and low-income individuals, describing in painful detail how these penalties perpetuated cycles of poverty. Each piece of evidence was irrefutable, backed by data and testimonials, painting a damning picture of a judicial system that seemed to target the most vulnerable. As the details of the report were read aloud, the media scribbled notes and filmed every word. Jordan observed Judge Williams closely, watching as the confidence in the judge's eyes was slowly replaced by apprehension. For the first time, Williams realized he was not in control. The entire room was focused not on him, but on the evidence being laid out, evidence that implicated him as a participant in the very biases that Jordan and his charity sought to dismantle. The turning point came when Lisa, gesturing towards Jordan, addressed the court again. This report, Your Honor, is the result of months of research funded entirely by Mr. Jordan Davis, she said, her voice steady. Mr. Davis is not only an accomplished entrepreneur, but also the principal benefactor of the Community Justice Fund, a man committed to exposing and reforming the very injustices that this report reveals. At that, Judge Williams's face visibly paled. The smirk disappeared entirely as he realized the weight of his earlier actions. The man he had so carelessly dismissed was now the leading force behind a movement that threatened to expose him and potentially alter the course of judicial practices in their district. Jordan, sitting calmly, met Judge Williams' gaze, his expression composed yet unyielding. He didn't need to say a word. His presence, along with the powerful evidence, spoke volumes. The courtroom was silent as reporters captured the judge's reaction, his discomfort now painfully apparent. Lisa continued, detailing specific cases in which court fines had resulted in financial ruin for families, particularly those in minority and low-income communities. She spoke of individuals unable to pay exorbitant fines for minor infractions, who subsequently lost their homes or their jobs, victims of a system that punished them not for their actions, but for their inability to pay. Each story was another blow to the judge's once unshakable confidence, and the courtroom audience listened, visibly moved. Judge Williams shifted uncomfortably, the realization settling in that his courtroom was no longer his sanctuary. With the media watching his every reaction, he could no longer hide behind his usual dismissive attitude. The Community Justice Fund had successfully shone a light on the very practices he had perpetuated, exposing him to scrutiny in a way he had never anticipated. The hearing ended with the release of the full report to the press, ensuring that the evidence presented would reach the public. As Jordan and his team exited the courthouse, the reporters swarmed him, cameras and microphones thrust forward. He paused, giving a short statement that highlighted the need for accountability within the justice system. His voice was calm, but his message was clear. This was just the beginning of a broader movement for systemic change. Back in the now empty courtroom, Judge Williams sat alone, the weight of the situation settling heavily on him. He had underestimated Jordan Davis, but now he faced the consequences of his actions. The world was watching, and the integrity of his court was now under question. Jordan's mission had struck its first powerful blow, and Judge Williams was left to contemplate the lasting impact of his own prejudices, knowing that the fight for justice had only just begun. In the weeks following the courtroom presentation, the ripple effects of Jordan's efforts became increasingly evident. Public outrage swelled as news outlets ran stories on the Community Justice Fund's report, with headlines highlighting the damning evidence of judicial bias and the disproportionate impact of fines on marginalized communities. Social media lit up with discussions about reform and justice, with thousands sharing their own stories of unfair treatment in the court system. The pressure was mounting, and soon enough, Judge Williams found himself at the center of a public scandal. Under this intense scrutiny, an official inquiry was launched into Judge Williams's courtroom practices. Each detail from the report became a topic of investigation, his every decision scrutinized and questioned. The public's trust in his leadership began to crumble, and his once respected name now appeared in articles detailing discrimination and misuse of judicial power. Former defendants came forward, recounting instances where they felt unfairly judged or punished under his rulings, amplifying the inquiry and tarnishing his reputation further. Meanwhile, the Community Justice Fund, Jordan's brainchild, was experiencing unprecedented support. Donations poured in from individuals and organizations, moved by the charity's mission and compelled by Jordan's story. The fund received grants from human rights groups, allowing them to expand their reach and take on cases across multiple states. What had started as a personal commitment for Jordan had now transformed into a full-fledged movement, one that challenged judicial prejudice and fought for the rights of the most vulnerable. The momentum led to a wave of changes across court systems, where policies regarding fines and penalties were reconsidered and revised. Several states adopted reforms inspired by the Community Justice Fund's recommendations, implementing income-based fines, community service options, and clearer guidelines for judicial discretion to prevent biased penalties. Local officials, swayed by the public's call for fairness, enacted these reforms as part of a wider effort to restore justice and equity. With Judge Williams facing potential disciplinary actions, he made the decision to step down. His retirement announcement came quietly, but it was clear to everyone that it wasn't voluntary. In his place, a more empathetic judge was appointed, someone who shared Jordan's belief in fair treatment for all and had a reputation for understanding the struggles of marginalized communities. This shift in leadership signaled a new era for the court, one that prioritized justice over prejudice. For Jordan, the victory was not just in the changes implemented, but in the movement he had helped ignite. The support his charity garnered wasn't just financial. It represented a deeper shift in public consciousness, a collective demand for a fairer system. Communities began organizing around the same principles that guided the Community Justice Fund, with activists and leaders inspired by Jordan's resilience and determination to stand up against systemic injustices. His story became a source of hope for others, a testament to the power of one voice amplified by integrity and courage. One evening, back in his office, Jordan took a moment to reflect. He looked around at the stacks of case files, thank you letters from those his charity had helped, and news articles documenting the changes his work had inspired. It had been a challenging journey, one filled with doubt, setbacks, and moments of frustration. But standing here now, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The painful experience with Judge Williams that had once fueled his frustration had now become a catalyst for something much greater, a movement toward true justice. His charity had transformed from a small initiative into a powerful force for systemic change, and his vision had become a reality. Jordan understood that the journey was far from over. There were still battles to be fought, biases to confront, and reforms to pursue. But he also knew that his work had already created a lasting impact. one that would continue to inspire others to challenge prejudice, demand accountability, and strive for a more just world. Jordan smiled as he closed the latest report, the fire of purpose still burning bright within him. He had turned his own experience of injustice into a beacon for change, and he was ready for whatever came next.